Welcome to Trench Diaries. Gold Beach. Part 4.
The Sherman continued firing, and it landed high explosive shells on the farmhouse, which began to burn. Some men started shouting that we should surrender, but the opportunity to do this was not there, as the Sherman kept firing all along our line. Also, I had seen what happened to the man who tried to surrender at the bunker, who was shot in the head, and I was afraid of that same treatment. In all this confusion, I heard shooting from the sunken path that led to the bunker, and I heard bullets that came from down there hitting the farmhouse walls. A moment later, a handful of English troops emerged from the path with their bayonets fixed. They were barely 20 meters away from us and were evidently filled with a furious rage. They were wild-eyed and roared out incomprehensible battle cries as they charged. Our MG42 team turned around and shot down 3 soldiers in a second. The MG42 was such a powerful gun, and the range was so short that these men were blown to pieces, almost as if by shrapnel. Pieces of their bones and flesh came streaming out behind them, and their uniforms caught fire from the heat of the bullets. I fired my rifle and hit a man as he ran towards me. Someone shot me, but the bullet deflected off my steel helmet, making me stumble and fall on my back. I saw one of the English with a Thompson gun shoot up the MG42 machine gun team. Afterwards, he fired like a madman into all of us, knocking many of us down. Other Englishmen came up behind him, and they charged into us, stabbing and slashing with bayonets. The Sherman held its fire, and the English troops overran the whole position. I myself stayed on the ground, with my hands visible, until an English soldier came up and pointed a Sten gun at my face. All I could do was spread my hands and shake my head, in a gesture that I did not intend to resist any further. This man kicked my rifle away, then called for other men to come over. These men searched my pockets, then put metal handcuffs on me with my hands behind my back and left me lying on my side, completely disregarding me after that. I could hear the awful noise of another mine-clearing tank approaching, and of course that meant that soon the other tanks could come up from the beach and move inland past the farmhouse. The house was completely on fire, and large numbers of English troops were now grouping around it, coming up from the sunken path. I think there were almost 100 of them, waiting to move ahead. At this point, German activity was at an end. What did happen, however, was that an aircraft came over the bunker zone a few moments later. I never actually saw it, because I was lying on the ground facing the house, but I heard it pass over us very low and at very high speed. I also heard firing of cannons or guns, and I saw many of the English troops collapse, and I realized that this plane had shot them up. It strafed them and then continued on inland. I never learned if it was a Luftwaffe plane or an Allied plane which mistook the troops for Germans, but I think it was probably the latter. I believe it was that short burst of gunfire that killed perhaps 10 men in that dense throng of soldiers around the house. After that, I was led back down the sunken pathway to the beach zone and placed with other German prisoners in a small paved square near the esplanade. I thought that I had held out to the last possible moment, and I did not feel ashamed of being a prisoner. I recall that the character of the English seemed to change very quickly. When they attacked us, they were very ferocious and eager to use their bayonets. But after we were taken away to the square, we were treated well. Our handcuffs were removed, we were given water, the wounded were allocated a medic who in turn asked for German volunteers to assist him. Our treatment was very humane in that respect. Having said that, many of the local French people emerged from their houses and looked through the railings of the square at us and made insulting remarks. These were the same people we had been bartering and trading with 24 hours beforehand. Some of our troops cursed the French and promised to take revenge when the English left the area. You must remember, we still didn't know if this was a permanent occupation, despite the huge army the Allies had. Some of my fellow prisoners were sure that this was a Dieppe-style raid, and they threatened the French with retaliation when German control was restored. Some of our men really seemed to believe this. Dieppe was said repeatedly among us. This is just another Dieppe, they'll be gone tomorrow, and such comments. Others pointed out the incredible resources the Allies had used, and they said that such an investment of troops and material would not be expended on a short-term raid. I myself agreed with this view. The sheer number of ships and planes involved was colossal, as I had seen myself from the bunker. One of the men there had been to Dieppe in 1942 after that raid, and he told us that the Allies had dropped thousands of leaflets by air during that attack, which said, "This action is a raid, not an invasion. Civilians must not risk themselves," or some such thing. Very sporting of the English indeed. But on June 6th, no such leaflets had been seen, which further suggested that this was a permanent incursion into France. Also, of course, we prisoners discussed the very obvious question of why the Allies would want to capture this particular beach, which had no harbor or port facilities. Some said that this proved it was a diversionary attack and that the main attack would be made against Cherbourg, Granville or Calais. You must remember that we had no information about any other landings that morning or the wider Allied operation. For all we knew, this was a single attack on an isolated beach. While all this was being discussed among us, some of the exchanges that our men had with the French civilians through the railings became very angry, and the English guards fired shots into the air to disperse the French quite roughly. One of our troops tried to take advantage of this confusion and attempted to climb over the courtyard wall to escape. He could not swing himself over all the way and remained clinging to the top. One of the guards, who had impressed me as a very humane man before by giving us water and supplies, he walked up to the man and just shot him in the back. This was quite unnecessary, but I think he did it to keep control over us. At many times afterwards, I noticed this trait in the English. They changed rapidly from being friendly or so-called gentlemen to being very ruthless, even brutal, and they could turn these different sides of their character on and off very quickly. At this point in the day, it was still only before noon. All this had happened in one morning. It was very difficult to accept that the situation had changed so much and so quickly. Throughout the day, more prisoners were put in among us, and these men told us that they had been captured some distance inland. All the time, streams of Allied aircraft flew over us, heading inland, and others returned out to sea. One by one, the men who said that this was a temporary raid gave up the idea. In the afternoon, the English insisted for some reason on sending a German-speaking English army priest among us to listen to any spiritual concerns we might have had. This was met with severe derision. I still recall the face of the army priest, who was very angry at his reception. We heard explosions and detonations from inland and from the beach throughout the day, and naval bombardments from offshore, the shells of which traveled over us with a sound like an express train going past. The sound of engines never stopped for a moment. Planes, tanks and trucks were constantly moving. In the evening, we were taken out of the square and led to the beach. The guards made no attempt to blindfold us or to prevent us seeing the situation. The scale of the operation then became clear to us all, and most of us fell completely silent at what we witnessed. The seawall area was being worked on with armored bulldozers, creating a huge ramp for vehicles to drive on. There were many destroyed vehicles and tanks, some still burning. I saw my bunker, which had collapsed in the frontal part, and there was smoke coming from the rubble. The beach was completely full of transports, including many vehicles we had not seen and we did not even know how to describe. Amphibious trucks, tanks with flotation screens, enormous landing craft that were unloading whole columns of jeeps and tanks directly onto the sand. The English had already cleared a wide lane through the beach obstacles. How they did that so quickly, I have never understood. Perhaps they used linked explosive charges. This lane was an absolute highway on the wet sand and out into the sea itself. There were still many bodies which were lined in large groups on the sand and partly covered with tarps. Despite the distinct lack of religion among us, many of our men crossed themselves as we passed these. One thing in particular struck many of us as amazing. All along the beach, there were no horses. This was a surprise to me, and many others found it equally astonishing. This huge army had brought with it not one single horse or pack mule. All their transport was mechanized. It may sound bizarre today, but this impressed us greatly, showing that the Allies had no need of horses anymore because they had such huge oil resources and production capacity. Because, of course, the German armies used horses for transport on quite a large scale right up until the end of the war, due to limited fuel and constraints on vehicle production. Every German unit had its stables and a veterinarian officer, and here were these English without any of it. For us, this symbolized the Allied capabilities. We were put into a landing craft and told we were being taken to England for processing. Out at sea, there was a multitude of boats, many wrecks half submerged, some still on fire, and in places there were bodies still floating, their clothes swollen by the water. There were enormous warships stationary in the distance offshore, flying their flags as if the whole war was now concluded. In fact, the last thing I saw of the landing force was a British sailor on the prow of a battleship scrubbing the deck with a broom. We passed next to this great vessel in its shadow. As we moved away, it began firing its guns inland over and over again. The noise was deafening. Those were the last shots I heard in my war, which lasted a few hours in all. It is important, I feel, that these things are put down somewhere. I do not wish these things to be forgotten. This happened 10 years ago, and I am not yet 30 years of age today. I am still a young fellow, and yet I feel in some ways like an old veteran, describing all these events because they are not spoken of among either the Germans or the English. It is as if these actions never happened. After D-Day, I was taken to a prisoner of war camp consisting of huts in Yorkshire, England, where the guards treated us well. We were able to send letters, although we did not receive any in return. Various neutral inspectors from the Red Cross, who were Swiss and even Brazilian, visited occasionally. Of course, this was all too good to be true. After a few months, I was in fear of my life, but this was because of other prisoners and not the camp itself. Many of the prisoners were mentally unstable, and some were SS or Hitler Youth types obsessed with prolonging the war. Incidentally, I hope that one day the story of the POW camps in England is told. I think that there were 500,000 Germans and Italians in those camps, and the English never discussed them. The things that went on in those camps were completely insane. In my case, I was under pressure to join a team of ex-Hitler Youth boys that had been captured in Normandy, who had planned to break out of the camp and take control of an air base on the eastern coast of England. My poor physical fitness was of no interest to them. They just wanted people to distract the guards with a staged rebellion to cover their escape. This was in winter 1944 to 1945, when it was clear that the war was lost. My refusal to join this plan led to threats against my life. Some prisoners were being offered work outside the camp, and I joined this group, being assigned to work on vehicle repairs at the depot in a nearby town. After some time, I was allowed to live outside the camp in return for an oath of good behavior. I took lodgings with an elderly lady in the town who treated me as one of a family. I still correspond with her at Christmas time. In fact, I remained in England voluntarily for 2 years, and after the war ended, I worked on vehicles, and after I returned to Germany, I opened a small mechanics workshop. I have not yet returned to Normandy. Possibly this is something that I might do in the future. Epilogue. Marten himself was part of the 716th Infantry Division. This division suffered enormous casualties in the time between D-Day and the end of the war in Europe. It was almost completely wiped out in the week after the invasion, after which it was re-established sometime later and wiped out again. It was re-established a third time in early 1945, got encircled by American forces, and again was almost completely annihilated. Its remnants were then taken prisoners by the Allies. In total, the division lost almost 15,000 soldiers in 10 months.